I have here with me from the Savage, on this side, the Savage Pathfinder development team, Mike Barbeau, chief architect behind the conversion of Rise of the Runelords for Savage Worlds, also a vital member of the Savage Pathfinder dev team. And we are here today to talk to you folks about spellcasting in Savage Worlds.
Yes. One of my favorite
Which-
things. I love spellcasters.
It's a, I would say, hotly debated topic currently. I think it's probably the most controversial thing we've done. Maybe classes might also be as controversial for Savage Pathfinder, but spellcasting is definitely up there.
Pretty close for sure, yeah.
So we're going to kind of hit this in kind of, I think, two phases, just to because it makes the most sense. Kind of like when we were talking about shield facing, and we broke down, okay, where did we start with the issue, and what were the steps that we went through, and where did we land? Which land is, in vague general terms, until we send that book to the printer, nothing is set in stone. So let's start with where we started talking about the changes to spellcasting for Savage Pathfinder. You know, thinking back, how many months? 5 or 6 months? 7, 8? I don't. Time
When
has no
did
meaning
you
anymore.
when did you start that 900-line spreadsheet?
I don't know. Can I? I don't think there's an easy way for me to figure that out. At least not in a short time span. But so one of the first things that we were talking about, this was back when the design of Savage Pathfinder was basically everybody on the team communicating in emails. And I think one of the things that we kind of started with was really thinking about spellcasting as how it related to classes, and also how we go from 600 some spells to 50 some powers in Savage Worlds. So, Mike, what's your earliest kind of recalling of the things that we were talking about with wizards and sorcerers and bards?
I think for me, it was trying to identify how we were going to take all of these complicated mixed abilities and bring them down into something so simple. Because, you have spells like Planar Maelstrom that come up. And they just do so many different things that we want to make sure that we can capture all of it, but some of it's unrealistic just because of the huge jump in power you have from first level to ninth level spells.
Oh, I'm muted. I also remember that being kind of the big thing that we were talking about, is that there's a very different kind of scale almost of what high level Savage Worlds versus high level Pathfinder looks like. Savage Worlds is all like, by its baseline, a lot more grounded. I mean, you can certainly get crazy with things like the Super's Companions, but it is so much a game that the littlest guy can kill the biggest person, that it's not something that maps 1-to-1, right? Also,
Right.
because the worlds that you get, like the setting of Galeria, and all the things that other people made for Pathfinder and for D&D and all the other D20 games, those worlds end up looking so different because of the impact of the rules on them, that it wasn't even something as simple as us just going in and saying, okay, well, what's the flavor, what's the lore and the writing behind it? Because this, in a lot of cases, and this is very true with spells, the system and the fiction are the same.
Oh,
And
very
they
much
do
so.
not have any sort of difference, because they built the world to reflect the system, which I think is a little backwards from the way we generally think of designing things for Savage Worlds. I remember when we were doing the Sandpoint Devil that you did all the stats for, and we released that during the Kickstarter. One of the things folks were talking about was how lethal it seemed compared to the Pathfinder version. When we were talking about how, well, yeah, because if I heard something was a Sandpoint Devil, that thing should be pretty nasty. Realistically, it should be a really nasty thing, so it should be a nasty thing in our game.
Yeah, it's really interesting because when you're playing a D20 system, the powers you have at first level are, I mean, you don't think about magic missile really late in a campaign, right? Like a few D4 isn't doing much, but a big bolt at novice is still a big bolt at heroic, right? And so there's just so much that continues, and that you don't need to evolve as much or need to get as crazy. And then you have all of these one-offs like alarm, right? That, doing Rise of the Rune Lords. Spoiler alert: there is the spell alarm that's used in it, right? And there's tons of other spells in this magic heavy background world, which is used one time, twice, but it's built into so many items or some mythos or some iconic dungeon that it has to be acknowledged in some way, and you have to figure it out.
So we really, I think the first part of this conversation is go back onto the Pegging YouTube and watch when I did the first design corner on transitioning Pathfinder spells to Savage Worlds powers, because we're not going to dive that deep into the specific how do we convert them one to the other, because we've already talked about that. But that was one of the first things that we thought about. We thought, what are the class edges going to look like for spellcasters, and then what powers are we missing, basically, because we want to use the toolbox, right? We've got a bunch. We got 54 powers from Suede. I think it's 52 or 54, and you build a library, you use the library. So first we had to figure out, okay, what's all the stuff that we could just we can handle more or less using our powers, and then move on from there. And I think that got us to a point where realistically, you're not all the time using powers that don't already exist in Suede, right? We have so much leverage with things like Bolt, where Bolt can be, Fireball, or even Shocking Grasp with a limitation, this and that, right? Acid Arrow, all those different things, that we didn't need to spend a lot of design time on, let's convert these. We had to then figure out, how do they play in the game, right? When you're in an encounter, what is the spell usage looking like?
Well, and not just what is the spell usage looking like, it's like how often is a spell getting used, right? So one of the big things that has definitely been brought up, and we'll talk about it a little bit here, I'm sure, is PowerPoint recovery, right? Because in Pathfinder you have so many spells per day, and then you rest. People iconically call it the 15-minute day, as your wizard blows all of his spells in the first combat, and then everybody has to rest for him. Whereas normally you have in Suede this really fast PowerPoint recovery, which is amazing. But at the same time, you also run into situations where you start upkeeping a spell or a power way longer than you theoretically should, and you start running into these balance issues as you're now trying to balance it against magic items or other abilities going on, and then you have to gauge it against an enemy's abilities, and so being able to make duration fit correct. We didn't want to change a spell's duration to be, from 1 round to 5 rounds, or 5 rounds to 10 hours or anything. We wanted to keep that the same, and so we had to look at PowerPoints as a big thing.
Right. That's one of those places where, especially with the durations like you were talking about, it's something that is. I see it both as a compliment and a critique of the powers in Savage Worlds, especially once we started doing Savage Pathfinder, because there are folks that they want the invisibility from Pathfinder, right? I can cast it and it can run for minutes or hours depending on the specific spell I'm casting for that effect and my level and all those things. And then there are other folks that I think it's kind of, what is your taste, right? For the folks that like lower magic stuff, which Savage World settings tend to be lower magic, having it last 5 rounds and not be something that is, so long, fits that. And so that's one of the things we also kind of, throughout this entire process, we were always writing that line of, the kind of expectation and tastes of our current audience is super important, right? They're the folks that have kept us in business for, it's what, 25 years at this point. So we want to make sure that it's still the game that they recognize, but at the same time, the whole point of the game is that it can leverage a lot of different settings, a lot of different things. So we want to make sure that that fantasy of Pathfinder, right, and that the Pathfinder players coming in, and even our players who are like, I want to experience the fantasy of Pathfinder, they have that experience. And so it's a very fine balancing act. And so that's where I think we can come into basically. So for folks that don't know, we do a weekly for like 2 or 3 months. It was a bi-weekly playtest of Rise of the Runelords, where myself and Shane Hensley and Simon Lucas, Chris Warner, Carl Kiesler are all playing, and then Mike has to sit through us just making his life miserable as a GM. And so, what were those early experiences like before we had really made any changes to any of the spellcasting stuff for you as the GM?
So very early on, I don't think it was really calling in as big of a note because of what you guys were doing, right? When you expected to take out, hypothetical trash mobs like goblins, you were doing it at a good rate. But Pathfinder has a lot of bigger creatures that are still meant to be kind of like, again, let's just call them trash mobs, where you go in and hack and slash. And you guys weren't noticing the difference in difficulty, right? Everything was still missing. You were still one-shotting everything. And so it was basically Goblin 2.0, when that was supposed to be far from the case. And so, you guys would get to see me staring at a screen, looking concerned, because what I was trying to do is figure out what changed, right? What do we need to change? How do we need to adjust something? And sometimes that came from having to sit down and identify a power that was doing a bit much protection, or trying to identify what the creature wasn't doing to meet expectations. And that's a whole nother story. We won't get into creatures here. But then it became looking at, is the issue that, protection is too high? Is the damage on this not high enough? My favorite one, do you remember the first iteration of Ballad of Inspiration?
That was the version where you were taught, where you would activate it and it would last for a couple of rounds, and everybody within a certain radius got, what was it, a +2?
Yeah, it was a +2. On paper, it looked fine, right? You looked at it and you're like, oh, I'd use this power. It's pretty cool. And then, I sat there and did the math, and I was like, all right, by spending some bennies, I can basically maintain a +2 bonus for the entire party for 85 rounds. Well, that's what I'm doing for the rest of my life, right? Even if I short my, every other power I do as a bard, I'm getting a +2 because of this. And so, we had to just take these spells or these powers, look at what we did and say, okay, we've matched the theme a bit, but now we've really got to pull back, right? We got to pull back and see how it falls in with every other powered in the Suede Rainbow. And that got changed to be an edge, and it functions much better now. But it's a big arc, and I think a lot of people who may have seen the book already will have seen the change to deflection, to protection. There's, I think, another setting one. People will notice that Dispel went down in rank, right? Because Pathfinder is such a magic-heavy world. From level 1 all the way up to level 20. You're just seeing innate powers. You're seeing spellcasters, your spellcasters, and so for this setting, it felt important to bring that in line so that it was usable by the players, by the heroes, and by enemies, all at a good starting base. I'm not saying you always need to take Dispel, but it is a very handy power.
Yeah, it's one of those things where, Shane always says we convert the setting, not the system. But like we talked about a little bit earlier, the setting and the system are so intertwined in so many different facets that sometimes things like, needing to bump Dispel down because it's just magic is just so prevalent. Galarian is an incredibly high magic world that if you don't have that as a tool already, then you're going to be kind of behind the curve, and it's going to feel like you're lacking something that you otherwise should have. And definitely with what you're talking about with the levers that we have to pull, right? Because certainly, I think there are some folks that when we talk about why do we make these changes to spellcasting, something like protection, right? So for the uninitiated, protection by default in Swade, it's a +2 by default, and then a plus. Oh god,
+4 with a raise.
I'm second guessing myself because I can't keep track which rule is which.
No,
So
it's 2 and 4, and then you could also add a modifier for toughness.
Right.
Instead.
And one of the things that we kind of one of the other elements of the very first passive of doing the powers was looking at these are basically rough drafts of the epic power modifiers from the Fantasy Companion, because that was another we've already got this work done for the Fantasy Companion for these epic power modifiers. These are useful tools that we're going to be able to use in Savage Pathfinder, right? We also pulled stuff from the Supers Companion, because if you, again, build the library, use the library. And so we also had another modifier on there that let you get 4 points on a regular cast, 6 points on a raise. And when we're talking about, some folks their immediate response to why did you change that? Shouldn't you balance your encounters better? But that's the thing that Mike has been living with, especially with Chris. They've been doing the B series stuff. You have those levers to pull, but when you pull those levers over here, right? If I set this to a 1 over here, then that means that when we get all the way over here, that's set to an 11.
Yeah.
And so you can talk a little bit about things like the strength scores and how those.
Yeah. Never go do a deep dive on strength in Pathfinder. Let's just say that. No, but some of it comes down to when you look at an enemy, how many enemies do you want to have D12 plus X? Because if all we keep doing is raising enemies to be bigger and bigger and bigger, right? There's just half the book is everything's D12 plus 2, D12 plus 4. In order to take into account, a boosted deflection, everybody's fighting is D12 plus 2. And so it becomes, how much lift do we do over here, which could spiral everything else out of control, versus what do we modify over here, right? And so that's what we started doing, is we started looking at what was actually causing the problem. And it was 2 or 3 powers, I'd say about.
We'd gotten to, I think it was book 2 is when you get to the fort, right? Or is that book 3?
Let's hold off on that just because of possible spoilers, right?
But were we in book 2 or 3 at the point of playtesting when we made the big shift?
I think book 3.
Okay, so we've played through book 1, book 2, and now book 3 are into book 3 of Rise of the Rune Lords. And we spent a lot of time, okay, let's bump up this ability on this character. Let's, we added things like rending attack, which, if you take is it shaken or wounded, or is it just a wound?
Shaken or wounded.
If you're shaken or wounded by a rending, attack, then you need to make a vigor check at some point in your next turn. I think it's the end or start?
At the start.
At the start of your next turn. If you fail, you take a wound. And you keep doing that until you're healed. So we have new abilities like that are super useful. This was also the point where we were playing around with the notion that maybe gang up, either the total bonus that you could get could be higher, or you also add your gang up bonus to damage, all in this kind of arms race to figure out how do we make basically a group of non-magical creatures a threat to a group that's going to be, generally speaking, about half spellcasters. Because one of the constraints that we have on top of us that is always true is we are not rewriting Rise of the Rune Lords, right? Part of the promise is you get to experience Rise of the Rune Lords in the same way that a Pathfinder player experienced it, more or less, with variations. So we're not rewriting things. So we're not all of a sudden dropping in spellcasters where there were none. So we have to make sure that our just, I'm going to hit you with a big piece of metal characters are able to take on the party.
I want to throw in something there too. We're also not removing spellcasters. And somebody made a comment about deflection kind of being their worst nightmare there. Nothing feels worse than having an enemy spellcaster get a raise on deflection and every party member has to deal with that penalty the entire fight. And when you have, 2 or 3 or a creature with an innate ability that does it, innate power, sorry, you start seeing these the hero's kind of running around feeling bad because now they're not getting to use their skills. They're at a hindrance to do everything they want to do. They don't feel cool anymore. You can throw 500 goblins, deflection on all of them. But yeah, so we wanted to identify not just what was overpowered on the heroes or underpowered, but what would also do it for the bad guys. Because again, +6 armor on every enemy, even when they're just zombies, you're no longer killing zombies, you're killing tanks, right? And so it was about bringing that stuff in line. And it was very important to, make sure you had to make choices. Yeah,
And so,
exactly.
yeah, saying John Doom, I just pick up my dice at that point.
Mm-hmm.
Right. There's always an arms race between the enemies and the players, but you don't want it to get to the point where, and this was something we had started to experience, was combats that felt like they should have probably been 3 rounds, 4 rounds at most, were now taking 5 or 6 or 7 because all of these bonuses were starting to stack, and we were now, okay, I, the player, have to get a raise to hit, and the bad guy has to get a raise to hit. And so now everything's just inflated, and we're getting that. That's kind of one of the problems that hit point based D20 games have, right? If I have 100 hit points, it takes 10 times as long to kill me as if I had 10 hit points. We inherently avoid that problem in Savage Worlds by you've got 3 wounds, sometimes more, but for the most part, 3 wounds, and that's it. And so we want to keep it fast. We want the pace to continue. We want no combat unless it's really important to really be more than 3 or 4 rounds, because at that point we're missing one of the core pillars of our game, the fact that it's fast.
Yeah, we did one of our play tests involved fighting a dragon, right? Deflection went up. Deflection was an issue, and so he changed his tactics now. But it was able to be adjusted. The fight was able to be made interesting in a different way, rather than everybody just saying, all right, well, -2 to everything, I guess. Let's keep going. So
And so
go ahead.
I was just saying, and so kind of at that point when we were in book 3, we had that moment of, okay, let's look at what are we actually constantly banging up against. And at the time, we correctly identified the issue of, protection, deflection, these powers, and smite to a certain extent as well for being able to take things
Entangle.
out once you did hit. Entangle, right? These powers are coming up so often, right? Every single fight, everybody that can is casting these powers. So when that's happening all the time, the first lever you look at to pull is, well, how do we make you use it less? And so the idea came up that, well, what if we change the way that you got your powers back, or your power points back? Because, and this was like we were talking about earlier with the Bard, one of the iterations of the Bard, back when their inspiration ability was a spell that you just cast, I played a Bard for 4 or 5 playtests, and all I did every combat was use that spell.
You weren't the only one.
Yeah. If there's one thing that you do the entire combat and you never think to make other decisions, then that means we've presented poor choices, because there is no choice. That's obviously the best thing to do. So obviously, I'm going to use my power points every single combat to cast protection, cast deflection, cast smite, and then we'll move on. That means that we've given you a bad set of choices. So let's change something. And that first thought was, let's change how you get your power points back.
I want to say also, especially in a dungeon crawl, right? Where you're like, let's run not only from big combat to big combat, right? It becomes a lot less of let's explore and see what clues we can find, and more about, guys, I have X amount of power points. Let's just hold on to this +4 armor and +4 damage and run through the entire thing as fast as we can. And so that was another big thing with that. Sorry, continue with your PowerPoint thing now.
Yeah, so we said, okay, well, let's pull that lever, because it's a playtest. Nothing, again, until we send that book to the printer, nothing's set in stone. So we decided, okay, what is a way that is going to look like it's going to solve the issue, right? Well, what if in my adventuring day, basically my adventuring day, I had one set of PowerPoints to use. And if I ran out of those PowerPoints, then I'm gonna have to start thinking about other things to do or be more tactical with my usage of PowerPoints. And there's also, I forget who said it. It might be it's the Sid Meier quote, but if you're going to change something, either double it or have it so you see the impact of the change. And so we didn't just say, okay, let's make PowerPoints come back slower, but let's also say you don't get 5 PowerPoints for bennies anymore. Because if we're going to say, let's give people less PowerPoints and see how the game plays, let's do it. Let's not do it in a half measure and then wonder, oh, did we go far enough? And so all of a sudden, right, every single power that we cast is a very important decision. Whether or not I cast that 1-point bolt is now I got to think, am I really, they've got some cover. Do I really want to spend my PowerPoint on that? Maybe I should reposition. Maybe I should use this other power to set myself up for an advantage so I can do this other thing. Maybe I want to short more, right? And now I'm starting to gamble of, can I survive the penalty to my spellcasting roll and also take on the fact that if I fail, it's a critical failure and I don't get to spend a benny to re-roll. Can I deal with all those things? And those were all the new decisions that we're now working with. And I think, Mike, you definitely saw it from the GM side, but I think that worked in that all of a sudden us spellcasters were really thinking about how we're using our PowerPoints.
Yeah, very much so.
And as we kept going, right, we then also came to the idea of, well, we have another lever that we can also pull, right? We're doing not quite a new rule set, but it's going to be a self-contained thing. So you don't have to go into Suede to look up what protection does, and then go to Savage Pathfinder and look up what did we change for protection. Since it's an all-in-one rule set, then we can just change that rule, right? We can just change deflection, we can change protection and see what that does. And so then we pulled that lever. And I don't remember what was the inciting incident that made us think, oh, let's pull that lever as well. Do you remember, Mike?
Not offhand. There's been so many games.
Yeah, it might not have even been like I don't think we were still running into an issue. I think largely the change to rest solved that problem. But we just, at some point, somebody thought, well, we also have this lever that we could pull. Why don't we also pull that lever and see how it plays?
One thing I'm curious about, because this is something I brought up, and I don't know if people in the chat right now play a lot of spellcasters, but for any that do, I'm just curious, does anybody here at the end of a session, right, you're like, all right, we're 9:45, I know we quit at 10, or, hey, we're calling it early tonight. How many people just go, all right, I got 3 more bennies. Bam, here's all my PowerPoints back. I'm just curious if anybody here does that, or maybe they don't have power or bennies left for that at the end of the session. That surprises me when I see people.
Never seen anybody do that.
Yeah, so that surprises me. In a lot of the groups I play with, that's the obvious thing to do, right?
Tech Ogre doesn't usually have any bennies left.
That's fair. But that's the one of the things I looked at is how often do you have that many bennies left, right? How often can you do that?
I never had that many bennies left. Yeah, that's somewhat surprising because we would generally have we generally had at least a couple of bennies left.
Yeah,
so folks are spending their bennies, which is good.
I think this is also one of those things that's hard to tell, because every GM's different, right? What you give extra bennies out for, is it feast or famine, or is it just one of those nights where not enough stuff came up to warrant a ton of bennies being handed out? Or if you're like me, you're trying to track a bunch of things and don't think to hand it out when people are being witty.
So Panzermeier has that experience. They don't save them to do it, but if they have them, they will. They'll cash those bennies in for PowerPoints. But so we've pulled the lever of let's change how rest works. Let's pull the lever of changing how some of these powers work. Also because you have to think about the difference in the games, right? In Deadlands, what kind of armor do you generally have? Basically none, right? You're wearing clothes. On the subreddit earlier, somebody was talking about how they were brand new to Savage Worlds, and basically their party walked into the middle of an empty room and opened fire on a bunch of other folks with pistols, and everybody got smoked. And that reminded me of the scene from the movie Appaloosa, where the two heroes are standing out in the middle of the open, and there's four guys they're facing off, and they start shooting, and you think the movie's about to end because both heroes get shot like 3 or 4 times. And you're like, holy crap, are they dead? Right? So in Deadlands, you need 2 to 4 points of protection because you don't have any armor. But in Pathfinder, I've got this paladin over here chunking around in the tower shield and plate mail, and I've got the chainmail wearing warrior over here, and there's so much more armor that all of a sudden 2 points isn't what you need to survive, it's what you need to be pretty untouchable. 4 points, come at me. So we've pulled that other lever, we've pulled the lever of rest. And one of the things that is always a part of the conversation when you're going through these design cycles is, what have we lost? Right? So for instance, it kind of felt like we lost something when we couldn't spend bennies to get power points. Because what if I do need that one, I'm at 0 power points, but I really, really need to cast this one spell. If I can cast this one power, then we'll be good to go. I will save the day, right? And that's when having that Benny, putting it down and getting 5 points of armor, then that's a feeling that people will remember after the session, right? That's one of those moments that's why we have things like Bennies in our game, because we want those moments to happen. So we then thought, well, 5 power points flat is a lot, right? If you're, depending on your arcane background, you spend 2 or 3 bennies, you're back at full. So folks are now going to stop spending their bennies for other things so that they can use bennies to basically rest without having to actually rest, which then means that we have a way to overcome the thing we built in to help with some of the issues that we're encountering. Well, what if it's a variable amount, right? And so we landed on, well, what if it's a D4 bennies? Sometimes if I have 3 bennies, I will get 12 power points and I'll be basically back at full. But on average, I'm going to get, maybe 6. And that way I have that resource, right? And if I'm a good player, I can think about what's something I can do to get myself a Benny, right? What's a cool thing I can do, a in-character moment, a way I can make everybody laugh, right? Those behaviors that we want to promote in the game to get a Benny so that way I can get some power points back. From Tech Ogre, I saw the question, does the D4 ace? It does not. It's not a trait roll. Only trait rolls, right? And damage. But so we added that back in, and all of a sudden, having those bennies, again, we didn't have that problem of I've got 3 bennies at the end of the session. Now I'm back at full and we don't need to rest and we can continue on and we've circumnavigated the other system. But it still felt right. It felt like the type of thing that would be fun for a Savage Worlds player. And I think that's where we kind of, correct me if I'm wrong, Mike, but I think that's kind of where we stayed for a fair bit of time in the playtests of the slower recharge on the long rest, which we should point out, we didn't choose that because we were mimicking Pathfinder. It was a solution to the design problem. It could have, if it would have been, a 4-hour rest would have solved our problem, then we would have gone with that, right? It wasn't Pathfinder has long rest, let's add in long rest. That was never really part of the brief. It was always if you have to make it long enough that spending your power points and not having any power points is a big decision versus, if it's kind of, again, that thing of double it or half it, don't do anything by little amounts and then not get the results you want. But was there anything else that we really changed for a long time?
I mean, there was an increment in which you got more power points back, but it was only, you spent the Benny when you used the power and you got that many back. I think there might have been 1 or 2 small ones, which, we didn't keep, but you try it, right? You see what it looks like, you see how it feels. And then, we had that one for a long time. Should we go ahead and just start talking about what'll be in the next update in regards to PowerPoint recovery?
I don't know. I kind of want to keep everybody squirming in their seats.
I did say on Facebook that I would say a couple things. So I think I'm going to be a spoiler
That's fine.
kind of person.
We were going to get there either way.
We were. So you will still recharge D4 power points with a Benny. This is you. This is you tapping into that moment of pressure, pulling on your last reserves during combat, doing what you got to do because you didn't prepare. There will be a greater PowerPoint restoration outside of combat. Don, if you want to comment on that.
So yeah, so we've pulled all these levers, right? And we've basically taken all of the things that we can do to make everything work to the max. And at that point, it's kind of you start to realize, do we need all of these levers pulled, right? And part of this is, it's just the evolution, right? Design is an iterative process. We try something, we take it out. We try something, we take it out. We try something, we try something, we try something, we take something out. And as always, we want to make sure that it still feels like Savage Worlds. And so we decided, you know what? Let's go back to the Savage Worlds PowerPoint recovery for a couple of reasons. And this one moment really sticks out in my mind is kind of it's the example that we kept coming back to when we were like, let's go back to the original PowerPoint recovery. And the session that we playtested a session with the original rules, and then we did playtest the next session where you didn't get the PowerPoints back on the Benny, and you didn't get PowerPoints back hourly with rest. It was with the 8-hour rest. And in that first session, when we had PowerPoints freely, I used teleport to get us on top of a tower, right? And I spent like 15 PowerPoints to get the entire party there. And Chris had spent a bunch of PowerPoints, like 5 or 6, on making the druids familiar, invisible, so that they could fly around and investigate the place and scout out for us.
It was an interesting 45 minutes of kind of nobody did anything except continue a spell and let a familiar fly off.
But so we spent, I spent my entire load and then had to spend all my bennies to get the PowerPoints back, or we could have rested at the top of the tower, not gone deeper in. But we realized, Chris and I, we were talking about it. We were like, we would not do that with the new PowerPoint system, right? That's so much of an outlay of all of our power that we're not going to want to waste it in let's scout and investigate and traverse. We're going to want to save that for combat. That's kind of lame, right? I should want to use teleport to get us onto the top of the thing. And so that's when we kind of realized part of that is okay, actually I'm gonna interrupt myself. It's not popping up, so I can't pop it up for the stream. But Abuelo Saragar. Oh, hold on. I think I have to allow it on Twitch, and then it will pop up so I can put it on StreamYards. Yeah, there we go.
Oh.
Abuelo Saragar said, it's April Fool's. I'm taking everything with a grain of salt. We're not doing that. Everything we're talking about is real, and there's no gotcha here. But so yeah, so it was also incredibly telling in the design meeting that we were having, talking about some other changes we wanted to make. Shane just asked the group, is anybody against us going back to the Suede PowerPoint recharge? And nobody said anything.
That long pause, right? It's where, kind of like you said, right? We pulled all these levers and went, I think we can put this one back. And so now you can once again recharge 5 PowerPoints every hour. That also helps out the barbarians, right? Who get that fatigue, who need to rest and want to take a minute down. So that's a benefit there. The other thing I wanted to jump into here is the long resting, right? The nights. So one thing you'll see in this next update is we looked at the long night rest and went, all right, what is it we're doing here? We're taking this thing that feels very common in Pathfinder, that's even written into some Pathfinder adventure paths, like when the heroes do this, but we're not making it fun to do it. We're making it disappointing if you don't do it. So how can we fix that, right? So in doing all of these adjustments, we looked at it, and when you rest for the evening, you go down for 8 hours. Every player regains 1 Benny up to their max, right? So you can't go over. But taking that long rest, hunkering down, that's going to help you prepare and get ready for your next day or push further on. Now you got to be careful because it's not just you. The GM will also get a Benny, right? So you don't want to sit there and hunker down for 3 days just to get 3 Bennies back, because then your GM's sitting on a pile of Bennies as well. But it's a way to be able to enjoy the trope without being punished for not doing it, right? It's kind of, I don't know if anybody here plays legacy games. The thing I don't like about legacy games is tearing things up. I like adding things to it, and that's what we're doing. And there was a post here. The big difference is going to be the recharge via Benny. Yes. So it'll be a D4, and then I believe there's the edge that makes it a D4 plus 2.
Yeah. I'm not sure which.
It's Crispy that did it.
Okay.
Yeah.
So yeah. So that's something that that's one of many places where we've had that conversation of, we're doing this thing because, for instance, this is a conversation we've had with the ancestries, with the class edges, right? Like, we need a drawback here so that way we can give them something over here. And so we think of, oh, well, this is a great avenue to have this thing be a drawback. And I think this might be a good time to talk about the Wizard Spellbook.
Yes.
Because that's the exact same conversation we had of, you know what, right now, the Wizard Spellbook is basically just, it's a hindrance that the Wizard class edge gets, so that way we can give the Wizard class something else, right? Because we want the edges to, as much as possible, be balanced out to about the same as a regular edge. But, and Mike, I'll let you make the same pitch that you made that got us on the Spellbook path in the first place.
Well, so, I mean, first of all, a long time ago, I had a very different spellbook mechanic that would have had people probably cringing, because it was a lot more tracking. But the big thing is, especially in a campaign that's all about spells, wizards love finding spell books, right? You walk in, you defeat the evil archmage, you find a spell book, and hopefully there's only one wizard, because he goes, gimme, 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 and he takes it and he starts going, don't have that one, don't have that one, don't have that one. Sweet, I got this one, right? Or you go and you buy the Grave Touch tome just because you're playing a necromancer, and you want that extra cool theme, the earthy smelling spell book. It was all something interesting. And what we lost was the interesting part, right? I still very much love spell books, but what we wanted to add back in was the wizard going, ooh, I'm super excited that we beat this guy. I'm going to add to my arcane might. So we've always had, the wizard learns via spell book, right? He needs these powers. He needs to find them. So to add to the, ooh, let me find this, if you're a wizard, you do still need to get all of your powers from either a scroll or another spell book, but when you take the extra power edge, you get 3 powers instead of 2. So if you collect 2 or 3 spell books and find some cool scrolls, ones that don't match powers you already have, you're able to take those, scribe them into your own book, and get more powers, a wider variety than, say, a sorcerer has. And most of you already know that's a very iconic thing for the Pathfinder wizard, is to be able to have this big spread of powers. And it's not something that necessarily breaks them. You still have issues if you lose your spell book, and you still have to recover it and make a new one, or hunt down the monster that took it. I love that people are doing math on how long they need to rest in order to give the GM a ton of bennies.
That Okay, so again, it's a relatively new thing that we were talking about. Where did my StreamYard go? Um, I don't know that we've gone so far as to think about that element of like, does downtime count? I think we're still figuring out the wording on that. But again, you're getting the early feed here. So remember, everything is not necessarily final wording as we describe it.
Yeah. And then since we're talking about wizard versus sorcerer, we did some touch ups there too. We looked at some of our existing uh, bloodlines because a lot of you, if you looked at the bloodlines, it's it's an edge, right? It's 2 points worth. It's a good balance for the most part. Uh, to look at it another way, the iconic sorcerer. She has the arcane bloodline, which basically makes her a wizard for the bonded object and such. And with all of our iconics, we stuck with the way Pathfinder did them because it's their iconic heroes. We're not going to change that. But we looked at some and said, okay, this one's a little too much. We looked at another one and said, okay, well, this one's a little weaker. And kind of like, look, when we looked at them, we weren't just looking for, oh, do we need to bump this up to be as cool as this other thing? We said, all right, did we up this other thing a little too much? And so you guys will notice the difference in terms of, I think it was the Abyssal versus Draconic bloodline. Draconic got a bump to where we wanted it. Abyssal got lowered to be equal with everything else. So it's pretty good there. But the other thing that we had been sitting on is kind of what everybody else knew, which is sorcerers, more power points. They're also innate, right? And so I believe it was Clint who had initially started this. But what we've done is their spell casting is now tied to spirit, right? It's their innate power, not their learning. So Boone, hey, if you get hit, higher spirit, unshake easier. The harder point is without having your smarts higher, your ranges aren't as good. So it's a little bit more difficult. But kind of like a lot of people pointed out, they get that 5 power point bump. So there's a little bit of give and take in there. And really there's just a lot that comes with those bloodlines, especially when you take the advanced bloodline edge that comes later on. You're right. You don't have to soak if you don't take damage. You're going to take damage.
So we've got about 10 minutes left before we literally have to leave because Mike has to run the next dev playtest because that happens in 10 minutes. So really quick, I'm going to scroll back up through because we made the promise that we were going to hit the earlier questions.
I do
so
know one.
Yep.
Let me jump on this one. Somebody asked earlier. There's a text fix. All spellcasters should be armor restrict. Oh, yep, you got it. It should be cloth. The phrasing used to be different, and so any made sense. It's reverted. Much like the monk is not going to say any anymore. Arcane background magic and miracles will be. I believe it was light armor, right? So
Yeah.
if you choose to take that rather than taking one of these classes with these, to be honest, I think cool abilities, you do get a little bit of a bump because you can wear higher armor than other people. And then I believe we also added in Arcane Armor, which is the one that lets you up your armor interference. A lot of you are going to know this, right, from Pathfinder. You can go from light to medium or medium to heavy. It's not as big of a save. If you're playing Pathfinder, you're going from like no armor bonus to like 3 or 5. For us, you're going from 1 to 2 or 2 to 3. But when you find that really awesome set of rhino hide for your Eldritch Knight, or possibly in the future your Magus, or if you find that celestial chain that you really want on your sorcerer to give you wings, you can now take an edge and you can use that awesome armor. So that's been added, and that'll help not only clear up the verbiage here on this, but for spellcasters who want to wear armor.
Yeah. for example, for that, right, we've gotten through a bunch of iterations on how like armor interference and restriction work specifically. It used to be, and I think we've talked about this in the design corner in the past. It used to be based on your the minimum strength requirement for the armor because we already had that system, right? Build a library, use the library. But then we realized, well, a lot of groups don't like that's something that a lot of players don't really spend a lot of time thinking about and focusing on. So let's make it something that's a little plainer, a little easier to understand, and not this like one small element of the gear system that not everybody is always fully paying attention to past character creation. Let's make it something that's a little easier to track. From Dersham80, how do you handle something like Prismatic Spray? I ask you to go and check out the PEG YouTube, and I talk about Prismatic Spray in Savage Pathfinder in the very first design corner that we did. Basically, we don't yet. That might be something in the future.
Yeah, that's something else, guys. We've tackled a ton of powers. There's more books, right? More chances to do these cool powers, especially ones that fit.
So this is Kristen Serrano said there's more of a concern than a question, but how the available powers, maybe they should be more suggested powers because trappings, you could get a burst to a druid and maybe start of ice sprays or splinters of wood. That's certainly true that with the trappings, we do make our powers very flexible, and you could figure out basically why anybody could have any power. But the reason we have available powers is that's another balancing tool for us, right? We can say you don't have access to X, Y, and Z because these other things that you have are so useful. And that gives us another lever to pull besides just how many powers you know, what power points do you have.
Let me throw out another change you guys are going to see. This is one I'm a big fan of. So you get your power, you choose your trapping. You will all notice, anybody who hasn't played Pathfinder before, there are a lot of creatures with a lot of environmental resistances and environmental weaknesses. So your trappings matter a lot more, right? So what we've done is there is an edge. It's Arcane Mastery. Am I right on that? I could be wrong. Basically, we've taken the edge in which you can spend a Benny to change your trapping.
Spontaneous trapping.
Spontaneous trapping. It's a Benny or PowerPoint. And basically now for one PowerPoint, you can change the trapping of whatever power you're going to do. So let's say you run into a dragon, you cast your acid arrow bolt, you realize, oh crap, that did absolutely nothing. Next turn, you're like, rather than just saying, oh, well, I guess I'm never casting bolt during this fight, you spend the extra power point, you change up the element, it does better, right? So you can experiment and change things.
So from ES Conrad 1109, is arcane background magic or miracle one edge or two separate edges? I think that's something that we might have to change up the presentation for. I think its intention is it's two different edges.
I think it's two different edges.
It's just we presented it as one because it's kind of here's the option if you want spellcasting. It's also, I don't think you're likely to take both of those.
This has been asked a couple times. Abuelo just asked it again. Sorcerer, 2 powers, 15 power points. Spellcasting is based on spirit, not smarts.
Okay, just do that up. Oh, did I just scroll past the question?
Not a problem. Yeah, and there was another thing too, having that hour recharge for 5 power points. Now being that knight, the paladin with mystic powers, or the monk, or the ranger, you're going to get those 5 back if you convince your party to rest an hour. Again, just another reason that you don't have one player saying, hey, let's take a break. You have a group saying, okay, maybe we can push a little harder. Then we can pull back, rest, bar ourselves up, something like that.
Crispy XIV was at 14, Crispy 14. So we've already addressed part of your concern there, but that makes me think something else that we're changing is cantrips. So the original draft of cantrips was written before we did the changes to PowerPoints, and that's why it seemed like such a big outlay of resources for I'm now going to spend a single PowerPoint for my cantrips. We're making some further changes because they should just be cool things that you can do, but it's really just changing some of the resources for it. We're still very happy with how cantrips have come up and how they've been implemented. So now you don't spend a power point unless you crit fail,
On
and
a
I
yeah.
think that's really the only change.
Yeah, that's the big change. Rather than being a cast and hope to recover, we went with a you don't spend unless you crit fail, right? Uh, it makes it feel better. It makes it work smoother. The dice felt better when doing it. And so overall, it's just a lot easier. And it should make the spellcaster be like, oh, I'm going to throw, trapping or a cantrip of bolt to make a force hand because I do force missile, mimicking mage hand, and I'm going to move this, and I'm going to try doing this, and I'm going to use a trapping to burn this, rather than feeling like you have to hold back, because we don't want you to. We want you to play with trappings. We want you to test. We want to have fun.
So Vinny the Mage asked, in our playtest, do we start the entire game over with new adjustments to settings, or do we go with the new rules as if the party died off earlier? Yes. Sometimes we will make a change and replay that encounter immediately or in the next playtest. Sometimes we just we all the time our characters just transmute into different classes and ancestries.
There's been a
And
running joke on that one,
yeah,
where the NPC's like, I don't know any of you, but I guess I'll stick around.
when we first made prestige characters that leverage prestige edges, we didn't talk or coordinate at all. We just said, okay, everybody go make a character that uses prestige edges, and we came back and we had a very suboptimal party that TPK'd. And so most of them died. I think we found my then next character for the next playtest died getting to the same point. So we found my old character, made the rules updates, and kept playing with that one. And then he died later.
Yeah, the big ones in which we stop are the ones that it's not where you sit down and go, okay, I know what went wrong, and I know why this isn't working. It's where you look at it and go, this whole thing didn't work. It didn't play out how we wanted it to. Why? And then we reanalyze and we make. Usually, it's a bigger change, right? Such as the adjustment to PowerPoints, and then we replay that whole fight. I think we redid that fight 3 times. I think the first time trying to get into the area, the druid crit failed twice on a shape change to go scout as a bird, right? And so we can't just say casting's bad because we had 2 crit fails, nor would we ever. So it just depends on how big the change is or how crazy something went wrong or went too well in some people's favor.
All right,
It was actually
through.
Clint. It wasn't Jody. But
Yeah.
I think she was nearby, and that's what happened. I think it's usually between 4 and 6 playtesters in our core group. I've run a few others that have gone 3 players, 4 players, one that's 5 players. I've not done any other than the design group as a 6 player. But yeah, I've play tested with all varieties. I think, Don, how much did you have for Hollow's Last Hope?
I had 4, so that way I was doing what the adventure recommends.
Right. I know Chris. He's done a few as well. Did we cover?
Folks, you're a little bit lucky in that I think events have conspired that we're not going to be playtesting tonight. My phone was exploding with emails, and I glanced at the title of one and saw tonight's game, and I was like, "What?"
No.
So we can take a few more minutes. We have a lot of work to do, so we don't want to spend a lot of time over. But are there any other? Yeah, well, are there any other questions or insights folks would like? We also threw out a couple of other rules changes, and we didn't necessarily dive into why those changes happened. So if you have any questions on why have we made that decision now versus others, feel free to throw them out. I think we'll stay for a few more minutes before we head out. Dersham 80, are we going to have scaling for more or less players? Absolutely.
Yeah, one of the big things to do is to take into account how many extras or wild cards are an equivalent threat based on innate abilities, classes, general makeup. And it goes for, it varies, right? If everything is melee only, like let's say you have a horde of ogres, the amount of things that you need coming at you is going to differ than if you have a well-balanced enemy group. But for Rise of the Rune Lords, in the sections where it matters or, where you would notice, yes, there will be.
Abuelo Sargar was earlier talking about how the Bards power list is very much support focus based versus having a lot of direct damage dealing powers. It's not. I mean, we take everything into account when we're building this stuff, right? So Inspire Heroics does factor into that a little bit, but also it's what is the fantasy of the bard, right? And when you're talking about a basic default out of the box bard, right? No special variants or anything like that, they're the support character, right? They're the ones that are going to help their allies and hinder their enemies. And another thing that's also very much true in our game versus a game like default Pathfinder or a lot of other RPGs is the barrier to entry for your bard to go up and be good at stabbing somebody is way lower, right? You don't have to spend a whole bunch of levels in fighter or whatever in order to all of a sudden now be able to be efficient in melee combat. So in the future, if we're tackling things like different bard variants that are more swashbuckler types, then we might include more edges, class edges, prestige edges, and the like that support that. But also, you can kind of do that out of the box with Savage Worlds. So that's one of the other elements that kind of goes into that thought process.
I think bards, as they are listed too with their spell list, if you were to take a look at a traditional Pathfinder bard, a lot of them should line up. Bards aren't walking around with a lot of heavy hitting powers. They are very heavy in the support. As was just said here, disguise, intangibility, stuff like that. And so if you're looking for a blaster, you may want to cross class into one of the more heavy hitting classes, because as a bard, you're kind of looking at the support or the swashbuckler archetype of a bard as well. You're not going to see as much heavy hitting on the bard side.
And so Buzz Sarger said he's talking more about things like illusion, disguise, intangibility. Again, like there's I haven't looked at it in forever. Again, that's one of those things that like I don't think the bard has really been like it's been in a very good place for a while. So I don't think we've necessarily gone through and looked through the spell list again. We will definitely do that for every single class before final, right? It's one of those things that we kind of generate the list of what seems immediately apparent and then go back through. Because again, we're in different mind spaces at different times when we're looking at this stuff, right? Early on, it's let's just all the things that like I can imagine a bard singing that, let's throw that on the list and get that first pass done. So we'll definitely look at all that stuff again. If there's stuff that seems like it's obviously missing, again, once the forum feedback opens up, which should be soon, we're again just a couple of pages to continue collating.
The other thing I want to point out too is, some people spotted healing was on a wizard spell list at first. We did not mean that intentionally. It was one of those things where, you start going through all of the schools of magic and you're lining things up. Somebody noticed that we had, I think, Song of Contempt we forgot to take out of there. And so there's been so many changes that kind of like noticing the space between, the I and the T of the word it's. We might have missed a power. It might have gotten taken out. It might have meant to get added back in, things like that. And so if you spot something, if you're like, hey, Bard has this, this, and this in Pathfinder, did you mean for it to have this, to equal? Post on the forums, right?
Yeah.
Odds are we're like, what do you mean it's not in there? Yes. Oh, nope, you're right. It's not in there.
Honestly, I was surprised when you said that, Abuelo Sargar.
Yeah, I'm not going to lie. I was like, of course they're already in there. Why are you even asking about that? So yeah, it's one of those things where we'll catch it and then we'll have one of the guys go in and make the adjustments.
So I think this will be our last question of the night. So from Crispy 14, do the spellcasting rules for multiple under multi-classing arcane backgrounds apply to arcane backgrounds not from classes. That's one of those things where it's basically the answer is yes, right? We've got some language to clean up and clarify as far as the other arcane backgrounds are concerned. It's one of those things where it's like what we were just talking about, right? Until somebody else looks at it, right? Internally we write a bunch of stuff generally, and then we pass it off to somebody else to do editing because they're going to see the things that we didn't notice. Because this is a collaborative process, and we've been talking about 15 you don't want to see our email inboxes of all the different things we're talking about. There's just so many different things that as you folks bring it up, and that's why we give you folks the opportunity to look at stuff early and let us know. Because there's confusion there, we're definitely going to clean up that language and make sure that that's clear from the get-go.
The martial artist post on Facebook was a great example. We took out martial artists. Somebody's like, oh, but it's referenced in these other places. And it's like, oh, shoot, I guess we missed cleaning that up when we did these other things, right? Shane caught a lot of the black powder stuff initially. It's one of those things, we looked at it, and once your eye skims over something for the 100th time, you miss it, and it requires these eagle-eyed, amazing backers out here who go and look at it the first time and catch something that we spotted a million times.
Absolutely, Sargar. The feedback posts have been super helpful. Like, one of the things that we always have to be careful about when we're talking about this stuff is, right, it's we never want to seem like we're being like defensive about anything we've done. We're always just trying to explain it, because feedback is good when you just get it. It's great when somebody is going from this, understands your mindset, and then it says, yeah, but that thing I said, I still believe that to be true, even with that context. So when we're explaining stuff or talking about why it might not, this happens all the time. Of like, I'll be on Reddit and somebody say, well, this is a problem because X, and I'm like, but you didn't consider why, right? It's always because we want folks to kind of see the perspective that we have on it, and then let us know, does that soothe your concern? Does it not? Right? And when it doesn't, that's some of the best feedback is I've now explained to you why we did this thing, part of the reason why we do things like Design Corner, and you still think that this doesn't quite work. That's the best feedback we can get.
The one thing I want to throw out there, and this will be the last thing, somebody made a comment earlier that they might use some of the core Suede rules for spellcasting. I get where you come from. I like certain I like certain house rules. I have plenty of house rules. Give it a shot is all I would say. Some things look a little different on paper than when you go and actually start running them. Some things that you think you would notice all the time and not like, maybe you don't notice them as much. Maybe you do like them. Check it out. There's been a lot of playtest hours that go into it, and you might, we might change your mind. Who knows? But like I said, we all have our own house rules. We'll all look at something and say we like this and not that. But I think a lot of the stuff we have in here, as you and your players go through and hunt down, either the Pathfinder glaring adventures that are pre-built or create your own, it's going to create a lot of interesting and tense moments, and just a lot of really epic encounters. So that's what I want to throw out there.
All right. So for next week, there's so many people voting on the poll that it kind of seems like a waste to not talk about the other things on there. So the second runner-up after spellcasting was talking about prestige edges. So we'll be back next week for Design Corner talking about some of the design behind prestige edges. Maybe I'll convince Mike to come back. Maybe I'll grab somebody else from the team. We'll definitely at some point have Mike back to talk about magic items. But until then, folks, keep sending in the feedback. The forums will open again fairly soon. For specific feedback, keep talking about it. It is one of the most rewarding things to see all of the people talking about, even when they're talking about things that they don't like, because it means that you're interested and you're invested and you want to see this thing and you want to play this game. So keep sending that stuff. We love to see it, and we will see you folks next week.
Bye, guys.